Welcome to another edition of Around with Randall, your weekly podcast on making your nonprofit more effective for your community. And here is your host, the CEO and founder of Hallett Philanthropy, Randall Hallett.
It's such an honor to have you join me on this edition of Around with Randall. I was reading my LinkedIn feed, which I probably don't do enough, but every once in a while I try to make sure I'm keeping up with what's going on with people that I know or people that I have a great deal of respect for. And there was a particular, I call it, think of it as an article, but a post, a video, 10 seconds about the effect of positive and negative influences on your life. And I was fascinated. I actually watched it 4 or 5 times. And what it really got down to was, how do other people's positive or negative effects, their attitudes, their perspective affect you? Which led me to think about this podcast subject in 2 different ways. Number 1 is, how does this affect you personally? But number 2 is, who are the people we want to be affiliated with? We all know that in the nonprofit world, we're not probably paid as well as other sectors. So the mission that we believe in, the environment that we go to every day, are critically important, because sometimes those things are going to make up for the fact maybe we could be making more money doing something else. So the people that we associate with become pretty darn important in how they affect us. I was fascinated by all of this, which led me to do a lot more research than I normally do. A lot of times in my podcast, I have a subject. I've got a couple cue cards or note cards, 2 by 3, and just kind of use that as, or 4 by 6, use them as kind of an outline, a couple notes here or there. This one required me to do a little work, which probably isn't the worst thing in the world, but I found some results that are really interesting. So I'm going to start with the science. There's a science to this. It's the thought process of emotional contagion, meaning somebody else's emotions, not just what they're doing, but the emotions behind it, not just what they say, but how they act, actually affect us much more deeply than I ever realized. So let's kind of walk through this just for a second. Then we're going to kind of transition it into the tactical. The first tactical is really about what is it you can do to make sure you're finding the right people to work around, maybe as a leader's perspective. And then as an employee perspective, or just in personal life, what can you do to avoid or deal with people that maybe bring some negativity to your world, to the challenges of your day? So the science of social influence, the science of emotional contagion. What we know is that in studies that have been, proven, academic studies, there's various ways in which positive and negative energy, attitudes, emotion affect you. So the first comes with the idea of facial expressions. That a recent publication in the psychological science publication indicated that when exposed to happy facial expressions, the people that are watching or seeing those facial expressions, their brains activate and create their own positive emotions. Think about this with a baby. I think about this because we have younger kids, not so much younger anymore, but 11 and 8. When you're a new parent, you just kind of marvel at the fact that you can sit over a baby as long as they're not wet or extremely hungry, and they lay in their crib. You can make faces, and when you smile, they smile. That's what we're talking about. That when we are in a setting with someone, we tend to mirror their particular perspective, their facial reactions. So this is the fact that mirror neurons, our brains are mirroring others. That we also know when we talk about social networks, that when we see happiness spreading, it is actually contagious. So in a 20-year longitudinal study at the University of California, San Diego, they studied that happiness has a contagion effect and spreads through these networks. And we have data that if you're in close contact with someone who's happy, you're 15% more likely to be happy yourself. Think about that. If you surrounded yourself with people who are always happy, you're likely to mirror that. What's interesting this is the antithesis of what most of us think of, and I'm not heavily involved, but I, as a parent, am concerned about it, was social media, and particularly with teenagers. That a most of, or a great deal of the conversation, not reacting to a some kind of video on TikTok, if it's still around, but really about the connection we have with each other, that teenagers are deeply affected by this. This is why many parents, and we would be amongst them, really are trying to pull back on the availability, in our case, none, for social media, because kids aren't able to address it. And so the opposite is true, is if you allow negativity to affect the social network in which you believe in or work with or have association with, it actually has a negative effect on your disposition. Third, kind of the cues. So thinking of how people kind of look and react to things, body language, kind of in feedback, enthusiastic, kind of the thought process of conversation. When you're enthusiastic, other people are enthusiastic. A study from Stanford University found that when people have positive emotional interactions, they're 20 to 25% greater opportunity for productivity and engagement. So we've got all of these signs that are telling us that positive interactions are good. And the same is true of negative. The toll of negativity, when we talk about being around people that aren't all that positive, the Journal of Applied Psychology published a study that said that when you are working chronically all the time around a negative coworker, it reduces team performance by 30%. Another study, secondhand stress. So this is kind of building into, maybe it's not even you in the direct relationship, but you're witnessing it. That in the University of Hawaii and University of Munster, they did a co-study that found when you are watching stressful situations, even though you may not be involved, your hormones react, and it's called empathetic stress. And what's the outcomes of that? That when you observe someone else experiencing stress, you actually have a release of cortisol in your brain, and it increases 26%. And that affects your ability of how you view things. You view things more negatively. So even though you may not directly be involved, you are being affected. When it comes to health, and we talk a lot about this in healthcare on a positive side about gratitude, it also applies negatively. That a Yale University study found that when we have negative social interactions in some way, shape, or form, that the prolonged exposure of this negativity can have long-term health effects like immune suppression, meaning your immune system doesn't work as well, or you are more likely or being susceptible to illness. So the negative side of this is just as powerful, but the opposite direction, which makes it kind of double the positive. Why is this also important? Well, your well-being is important, and how you deal with other people and what you witness and their particular emotional state actually affects you. In an 80-year-long longitudinal study done by Harvard, a place that seems to know what they're doing, they found that people with a strong positive relationships in their life, the ones that have either personally, professionally, or more likely both, positive interaction, happier, more engaging, actually live longer. We also know that from a creative and problem-solving perspective, it's studied down out of the University of Michigan, that when we put people into certain circumstances, positive or negative, positive stimulus, negative stimulus, that the positive group or the positive environment is 20% more productive at solving problems and higher level creative thinking. All of this is to say the people you surround yourself with is really important. So what does this have to do with philanthropy? Well, as I mentioned at the top, the people we work with may be part of the reason that we want to be in this profession. Not only do we want to help others, but the people we work with trying to do the same, which gets us into the conversation about who are we surrounding ourselves with. So who we hire makes a difference. Now, I've talked about hiring principles in other podcasts of Around with Randall. You can go back and listen to number 84 about what it means to have hard and soft skills in the job. And that's more dealing with the work that goes on in grift officers and relationship building. We've talked about it from the perspective of education versus experience, episode 120. We've also talked about in episode 156 what are the three core things I actually recommend looking for in the people that we bring on, which is a fire in the belly. They're able to communicate. They have a kind of a correlation to the mission. Go back and listen to those for those details. But what I want to talk about today is specifically on the tactical to start with the hiring. What is it you can do to figure out if someone is actually a positive or negative influence on your office? Wouldn't we want to figure that out before we hire them? Then the secondary part will be what happens if they're already there? What can you do to mitigate that damage? So the first thing is kind of how do you figure out, beyond figuring out if they have a fire in their belly, they can communicate and that they, believe in the mission. There's a connective tissue in their ability to have some resilience and kind of move through the relationship building process. There are some things that I hadn't thought about that I would have probably liked to have instituted when I was hiring people. So the first is that in the interviewing process is asking some emotional depth questions. Things like when you talk about past experiences, not just when were you successful or had a failure. Can you share an example, a time where you really helped uplift a teammate or the team? Can they come up with something that talks about how they positively elevated people? Interesting concept. How did you approach a difficult situation when working with a difficult team? Same general premise. When you're talking about energy, nonverbal skills, nonverbal cues, when they speak, are they energetic? Do they engender enthusiasm? Or are they bland and dull, even though their answers are great? Do they smile? Are they generally happy? Do they make eye contact? We also can get a little bit into the values part of this to know kind of, are they a positive person? Do they view life in a positive way? What kind of work environment makes you thrive? How do you define success in relationships? Interviewing should be not just about, and this is kind of a growth opportunity for me, because I didn't do these things. I didn't ask these kind of questions. It should be more than just about job skill. How do they fit into the team? Number two option, you can do some testing. So things like Myers-Briggs, the Clifton Strengths, the VIA character, there are tests out there you can give. More and more organizations are doing this. Myers-Briggs is probably the most famous, most noted, because what it does is give you a platform of who someone is and how they fit into the team. So you could actually formalize this process. Number three is kind of witnessing interaction. When I went through my interview process to start my doctoral program at the University of St. Thomas, we actually had a session where they put a bunch of the candidates into a room and they gave us a problem to solve. The fact that what the details were is not that important. But I figured out in about a half a second, this had nothing to do with solving the problem. This is how we interacted with each other. What I didn't understand is that we were going to kind of be living together as a cohort for 3+ years. So the functionality of the group actually mattered. And the realization that there was not a limited set of degrees needed to be understood, which meant, could I help someone else get their degree, because their doctorate, because that doesn't offend or affect my ability to get mine? So that interaction was important. Why can't we do that in the job setting? Put them into a room with a couple of teammates that are already employed. How do they react? What do people think? Give them something to do. Watch their body language, how they listen. Do they engage? Do they try to dominate? All these things can lead to things about understanding. Are they encouraging? Do they have emotional IQ, EQ? Do they understand what the group's mentality is, how people react to each other? Are they consistent? Do they do it throughout? If you were to position, what a novel if you were to position this to have a 30-minute session, particularly for a leader, or an hour session to figure out, do they actually lead? Can you assess this idea of, number four, this idea of having longer term observations, which means you may want to, in your reference checks, if you can get them to talk, a lot of times legally, there's a lot, most are pulling back on their ability to talk. But instead of saying, well, they do a good job, how'd they get along with the team? Did everyone like working with them? Getting some personal references and not asking them, are they a good person? Because how do you interact with them? How do you feel when you get done working with them or spending time with them? Why do you choose them to be a friend or a colleague? These are all things that you can do, whether it's the longer term relational, whether it's the group setting, whether it's the formal testing, or whether it is really maybe adding some questions to what you talk about can give you a perspective. There are some red flags to be aware of. If you find that someone is constantly or frequently complaining or gossiping, that's a tough one. It's tough enough to work in an office without those things. If they're dismissive of other people's opinions or critical of other people's behaviors, judgmental, that may be tough. And they're reluctant, possibly, of celebrating the team's success or someone else's success. They're focused on them, not on others. So all of these things can be added to the interview process. And frankly, other than Myers-Briggs, where I think maybe you have to pay a little bit, most of it's pretty easy, could be very influential in whether or not you bring on the right people. So that's kind of an administrative leadership component on a personal level. What happens when you're around someone that is negative? There are several things that I might recommend. The first starts with understanding the root cause. I have a lot of challenges and difficulties and certainly faults. But I would say one of my strengths is that I can get to the root cause of a lot of different things by asking good questions. Some of that comes from law school and learning how to question through things in terms of how you sequence different opportunities to gather information. Some of that's just natural curiosity. A lot of it comes from my parents, who could get stuff out of people that couldn't believe they said things, and I kind of stole some of those kind of thoughts. There's reasons people act this way, many of which you can't change. Bad family situation, you're at the work environment, I don't know what you can do. Be supportive, obviously, but you can't solve it. Financial crisis, you can't solve it. They have clinical issues. Maybe there's depression or chemical imbalance, or even into they're ingesting certain substances that cause them to be negative. Can't change that. The key is to be aware of it. What is, by asking a few questions, the root cause of that negativity? I'm not sure that you can fix it, but what it might do is give you some perspective and maybe a little bit more empathy. Most people don't just come into the world negative. Things happen. Can you understand what they are and empathize in that relationship? Number two is, in terms of protection, is really to emphasize accountability and set expectations. The greatest expectation setter I have ever met is my mother. She lays out how she wants the relationship to be. Now, I also think the world of my mother, and she's one of the finest people I've ever known and feel fortunate that I have been influenced by. But you sometimes have to set expectations that if the negativity's getting to you, don't hang around with them so much. Pull back. We're dealing with this with my 8-year-old daughter, who's going through the chaos of getting older. I think it'd be just easier if they all just stayed in kindergarten, to be candid. Having a son is a challenge. Having a daughter is chaos. We're talking about, you got to have a lot of different friends. You got to be in different groups. You got to be open to different situations, because things change moment to moment. How do you find and create options and create expectations of what you're willing to put up with? Number three, provide, when it's appropriate, constructive feedback. This is like parenting. Now, it's tough if it's a social work environment and you're at the same level as someone else, or maybe you report to them. It's like, yeah, at some point that might be offensive. So you got to be careful when you use it. But there are some things you can do in that constructive moment to be appropriate. Number one is do it privately. You don't ever want to embarrass anything. When I think about disciplining or guiding or leading my kids, 99% of it, unless I'm coaching them on a field and I don't have a choice, is done behind closed doors. I'm never going to embarrass them by their behavior unless there's no other option. I don't want to. Now, I want to guide them. Well, the same thing is true of other relationships. Hey, when you do this, people kind of feel this way. When you do that in front of a large group, that's offensive. You do that in a small group, it's less offensive. You do it one-on-one and where there's trust, it can be helpful. The second thing is use specific examples. When you did this, the room reacted this way. Or when you did this, I felt this way. I hear my mother here because that's how she did it. When you did this, I felt this way. And I once, or maybe more than once, said, well, that's not fair. And she goes, whoa, whoa, whoa. These are my feelings. You can't change how I feel. This is how I feel. You can change whether you do anything about it or if you care, but you can't change the way I feel about it. Really profound effect on how you view other people. Also, focus on the positive. Find solutions. Hey, have you thought about looking at it in this way? Or, hey, have you maybe contemplated how this might be a little different? Number 4, really think about the strengths of positivity. Instead of in the constructive criticisms we just talked about, could you even reverse it and say, when you do this, you make me feel awesome. I do this with my kids a lot as positive reinforcement. When they do something, I go, it makes me proud as your dad, as your father. Could I go the other way and say, when you do this, boy, that really sucked? Yes. But I try to think about it in a more positive sense because I want them to elevate. I want them to smile. This is what we want in our relationships. So can you leverage that moment instead of being just constructive to be positive? Number 5, create a buffer. There was a story from many years ago from my wife where she had a friend who she worked out with. And that friend did not have a very positive viewpoint of life. Just was. And eventually my wife said to her, without anything I was involved with, but I kind of witnessed it, I just can't work out with you anymore. Because she knew when she'd come home, she was negative. She was ticked off. She was unhappy. She was tired of being complained to. She was tired of being complained about. How do you set a buffer? Personally, to spend less time with them. Professionally, maybe you look at how you spend other time in other teams or how you work around other people who are more positive more often. Do things maybe more alone. Set a buffer if at all possible. Number 6, set a limit for yourself, a net impact. At a certain point, if it's just overwhelming, your mental health is not worth it. Now, I'm not saying just run out and quit because that's bad if that's the environment. But I would say this. Life is short. Never more so than I realize that now. Some 17, 18 months since my father passed. Life is short. Creating options for yourself and being around the people you care about the most that make you feel good about who you are is important. Now, you can't do that moment to moment. In terms of decisions, you have to think about them longitudinally. But if you're just in a bad environment, plan a way out. Just don't walk in and quit. Look at other options. There are a lot of other places that can provide an environment that's incredibly more positive. The last thing is, and this is kind of, along the lines of setting buffers, but is really to implement a sense of accountability for yourself, for others. Sometimes the hardest conversations are the ones that are most structured and the most direct. I just can't spend as much time around you. You make me feel sad. Now, is that the first thing you should open with? No. Is that the middle thing you should open with? No. But at some point, it may be just as appropriate in terms of accountability measures that maybe you have to keep a record to say, look, incidents or conversations where you track because you're not quite sure or you feel. That's how my wife figured out this relationship issue with the person she was working out with. Like she finally started like on our calendar, like making a highlighted mark. Like when do I feel that? It's every day I'm with her. So how do you track this? And then make a decision. Know when to get out and say, it's just not worth it. All of this is to say is that what you need to be thinking about is how do you create a more positive environment for the people you surround yourself with, your family, your professional life. If you're a leader, no matter if you're a senior, the president, or an assistant, it doesn't make a difference. You can be a leader in this by being more positive. You can control what you do. And number two, you can begin to assess the people around you. Who are the people that make you happy? Who are the people that you believe in? Who are the people that elevate you? Because that's really what we're talking about. You can do so by the way you hire. You can also do so in the way you evaluate your relationships. That's the most important. The world of this and science of social interaction, the idea of emotional contagion, fascinating. Tactical ways that you can use it to your advantage to make your professional life, maybe your personal life, just a little bit better. Don't forget to check out the blogs at hallettphilanthropy.com. 2 a week or so. Get an RSS feed right to your inbox. And if you'd like to reach out to me, it's podcast at hallettphilanthropy.com. The world we live in is perilous much of the time. There's so much going on that we have to deal with. Today was all about realizing the value of nonprofits, but most importantly, the value of the people in those nonprofits, the donors you work with, the teams you work with, and how they can affect you. And don't forget, that means you're also affecting others. My favorite saying, some people make things happen, some people watch things happen, then there are those who wondered what happened. This is about making things happen internally and externally for a lot of different people around you and how they make things happen for you. And what we do is, at the end of the day, really about the people who are wondering what happened. What a great way to spend a professional life. Something to look forward to every day. I look forward to seeing you the next time, right back here on the next edition of Around with Randall. And don't forget, make it a great day.